Hi, and welcome to the OrgDev podcast. Well, we're absolutely delighted to be joined by the multi-talented Dr. Hayley Lewis. Hayley is the founder and director of Psychology. She describes herself as a pracademic, someone who actually makes psychology accessible. She's held a variety of roles in a fascinating career today in organisations such as the BBC and Croydon Council. Her organisation, Halo, specialises in team building, team development, executive coaching, and really gets into the heart of organizations, looking at things like leadership impact, resilience, psychological safety, culture change in high performance teams. And she also makes time to be a keynote speaker as well. You might actually know her from her amazing sketch notes that she does on all things psychology and leadership. And she's actually had all of her work recognized by being most influential thinker in HR twice. She's esteemed in many different qualifications. She's a chartered coaching psychologist. She's a registered occupational psychologist, and somehow, I don't know, Danny, how she finds the time here, but she also co-manages part one of the professional doctorate in occupational psychology at Birkbeck, and also honorary lecturer for the Masters in Organizational Psychology at City University. So we're absolutely delighted to be joined by Hayley. We've been tracking her work for a long time. When she agreed to be on the session, we're absolutely delighted. So welcome, Hayley. Thanks so much for making time for this.
Thank you so much for having me. It sounds like you stalked me. You say tracked.
We kind of do.
We do,
but in a healthy way.
Whenever I hear intros like that, I kind of sit there going, who are they talking about? I surprise even myself sometimes.
We left a lot of stuff out. That's the
Absolutely.
thing.
We had to edit that quite. Yeah.
That was the highlights.
Yeah, no one needs to know the lowlights.
Brilliant. Well, it's lovely to have you, Hayley. So thank you for joining us. So just to kick off, just tell us a bit about what you do. What does your role involve day to day? What does that look like?
Yeah. So my private practice role, so through my business, Hayleys Psychology, it's kind of like three pots, if you like. So the main one is executive coaching. So around 50% of my work is executive and management coaching. So I work with anyone from that first time manager, rabbit in headlights, what the bloody hell have I done, all the way up to kind of chief executive, managing director, kind of board of trustees, chairs of board of trustees and stuff like that, and everybody in between. The other two pots, so as Garen said, I do a lot of keynote talks and presentations, love that. And then the third pot is training and development. So with a particular focus on leadership and management development. So everything from designing and running courses, programs, workshops. And I do the odd leadership team build or team development session as well. So yeah, very varied, and I love it. And I obviously balance that with an academic role, as you said, at Birkbeck.
And do you work with across all sectors and industries, or is a particular niche?
Yeah, so my passion is the public sector and in particular local government. Unexpectedly, I fell completely and utterly head over heels in love with it when I joined local government in 2005. I only meant to go for 2 years. It was part of it's my kind of start of my 30s. I think like many of us, I had this very kind of linear but grand plan of I'll spend 2 years here and 2 years here, and then I'll work my way up and take over the world. And it didn't quite work like that. And I ended up staying in local government for 11 years. And I was just fascinated by the workings of a large local authority. And so yeah, so my passion is local government and good local government and helping local authorities who touch so many people's lives, helping them be even better.
Yeah.
But I work across all sectors, so and I love that. So I work with private sector organisations, I work with charities, I work with global organisations, so big corporates. But my home is always local government.
And that's a really tough place to be at the moment, isn't it? Local authorities, local government.
Yeah, and I'm very protective over it. I mean, don't get me wrong, you see some bad practice, right? But find me a sector that doesn't have some bad practice and some poor leadership. In my experience, and I've been lucky enough to work with quite a few. I mean, there's around 180 odd local authorities in the UK, I've worked with quite a few of them, from the small districts up to the big counties. And, for the most part, I come across really good people who care deeply about what they're trying to do, the people they're trying to help in some way and serve. And so the poor practice that we see, I would say, is not the norm, but it's often the thing that gets a big splash in the press. And so then we think everyone's like that. And that's not been my experience.
Obviously, you've done a lot of work with leadership and you talk about good local government. What is the role of leadership in creating good local government? It's like, in sort of my experience, I've met quite a few leaders from local government, and they're really impressive and have a very sophisticated approach.
Yeah, so I think there's a number of aspects of what I perceive or what I think good leadership in local government is. First and foremost, it's about making sure that the elected members, the politicians, are able to do what they set out to do and to serve the residents and service users and communities. So enabling that to happen. So within that, having a really good relationship with politicians of all colours, so from both sides of the chamber or multiple sides of the chamber, if it's more than one party, is really important. I think inspiring staff, Danny, you rightly said, times have always been tough. I've really got into The Crown recently. I'm late to the game, and it's been really, so we've been in the 70s, and it's all about the strikes, and there's been some reference to local government, and I thought, do you know what? The more things change, the more they stay the same. Actually, it's the same old, just a different decade. And so I think local government and public sector has always had a rough ride and sometimes been at odds with central government. So I don't think that's changed, but I do think the kind of climate we're all operating in now, and that local authorities and NHS trusts and so on and so forth are operating in, feels even more brutal, because not only are you dealing with a tough economic environment, you've got climate change on top, and it's constant scrutiny through these things. So, everybody's a journalist now. Every little thing can be taken out of context. That innocuous comment that councillor made at a cabinet, a kind of a council meeting, can suddenly blow up and become the thing that dominates your time as a chief exec of a local authority, when actually you've got other bigger things that you need to focus on. So I think I think some of the best local government leaders, as in officer side, that I've seen have kind of kept their nerve, kept their calm during really turbulent times, and keep staff calm and politicians calm. So kind of keep that eye on the horizon, keep people focused on what we're trying to achieve, keep people inspired, but also not be a walkover. Sometimes you need to speak truth to power. And so some of the best kind of local government leaders I've seen haven't been afraid of having tough conversations, whether that's with a community leader, whether that's with a political leader, whether that's with a partnership organisation, maybe the borough commander of the local police service. They haven't kind of veered away from that. So it's a big ask, isn't it? It makes me think of Jed Bartlett in The West Wing, who is just my hero. That's a big ask. It feels like, is that even possible to do all of that well every single day?
And Danny's a lover of West Wing, aren't you? So
I
that totally
adore
resonates.
West Wing.
We've watched it 3 times now. Getting ready for the 4th time.
I'm on 2 goes through, so
That's it.
I'm on 0, but soon to be 1 now after this conversation.
You've got to watch it. Brilliant.
So I'll put a link to the West Wing in the show notes.
Absolutely.
For all of you today. So brilliant.
And if the producers could give us a cut of the proceeds,
yes, that would be
really
that would be great.
Yep. Absolutely. So you've got a multifaceted career, and obviously, you've been heavily involved in organisation development. What was your journey? Has it been linear? Sort of thumbing through the career catalogue at the age of 15, going, right, that's it, I want to be organisation development. Like, what's been your journey to date?
So nice question, nicely lined up, because you know what my answer is. So no, not at all. So I did my undergraduate degree in the early 90s, and I did history. I love history, still do. with a minor in sociology and psychology. And so when I left in kind of 95, I my dream would have been to work somewhere like the Imperial War Museum or something like that, and that didn't work out. I ended up being a catering manager somewhere just to earn the rent, and did a series of jobs that paid the rent but didn't really spark my fire. And I remember it was like 97, and I got it into my head I wanted to work in an office because I wanted the glamour of wearing a suit. She says, sitting in her comfies. And so I was in a catering role at the BBC, and then a job came up, an office job came up in the BBC's conference centre. And so that was my first step into an office role. I felt like a working girl. I felt like Melanie Griffiths. It was great. And I loved that. And then after I'd been in that role about a year, and myself and a couple of the admin team got asked to support a team build. So it was a leadership team build for a department in the BBC, and they were doing this 3-day team thing up in the Lake District. I mean, this is the 90s. It was when the BBC had more money than God. And so I mean, I was like in my late 20s, staying in a really what I thought was luxurious hotel room in the Lake District, thinking, wow. Anyway, the 3 days went on, and myself and my colleagues, the two other admin people, did our part, made sure everything ran smoothly. And on the last night, we had a dinner, and I got placed next to the head of the department. Big mistake. And I was 2 glasses of red wine in, and he asked me, "What do you think of how it's gone?" And I told him, I was very precocious. I told him that I couldn't see what difference it had made. I couldn't see how the money had been spent, like the value. They all seemed to still not be getting on. And anyway, so I got the train home. And I know this is a very long story, but it's worth waiting for. So, well, I think so. So I got the train, and I got back, and I said to my flatmate that night, I think I've lost my job. And she said, "No, it can't be that bad." And I thought, yeah. Anyway, next morning I got called into my boss's office, and I thought, oh, here we go. And my boss at that point, her main role was as the head of the psychology team, but she had been covering because our manager had gone. And so she called me into her office, and I thought, oh God. And she said, such and such was really impressed with you. We've had a little chat, and he thinks you're a natural psychologist and thinks that you should move to my team, and we'll do a bit of an apprenticeship, and you'll train to become an occupational psychologist.
Oh, wow.
And I remember sitting there going, sorry, what? And so this was in the days of Ask Jeeves. Google didn't exist. So she said to me, go and find a postgraduate, because you need to get a postgraduate degree. I was like, because I'd wanted to do a history master's, and I couldn't afford that. So I thought, oh, some brilliant. So I went on Ask Jeeves, what is occupational psychology? And then so then moved to that team, loved it, learned the profession. And after about a year in that role, Greg Dyke took over as Director General and kicked off, at that point, what Harvard Business School called the world's biggest culture change program. In fact, it's probably still up there. And he brought in some experts in the field of organizational development, one of them being the wonderful and much missed Dr. Mian Chung Judge. And I underwent my training with her in all things OD. And myself, and I feel quite emotional saying it, and myself and some of my colleagues, she took us under her wing. And yeah, I didn't expect to get upset, but yeah.
Wow.
What an apprenticeship. Yeah.
Yeah. Everything I know about OD, I learned from her.
And I think it's, for people that may be new to this, it's probably worth giving a bit of an introduction in terms of some of the work that she did and why she's so esteemed in organisation development. So what was she known for when she came in, and what
wasn't she known for? So her expertise in particular was around whole system change, and within that, group dynamics, and how to take groups along on the change journey, and the skills that you need to be a really proficient organizational development practitioner, everything from that speak truth to power, to knowing when to hold the silence, to the harder aspects around the analysis of data, and she was incredibly well known for her whole system thinking, and in particular her approach to, as I say, the group dynamics aspects. And she had huge experience around that, and was proficient in all sorts of techniques and approaches, which again, she taught all of us. So she designed an OD program and put a number of us through our paces on that program. And then we became part of a core group of OD consultants supporting this 3-year culture change program. So yeah, doing everything from running the appreciative inquiry workshops to the analysis to then developing the action plan on the back of that. It was just incredible. And she just demonstrated such expertise every step of the way. And all I kept thinking was, how can somebody be such an expert at all of this stuff? But she was.
I'm really interested in how she entered a system like the BBC, because the BBC is such an interesting organisation. I think, was it probably an unusual reference, but John Craven said the reason BBC TV Centre was a circle was so that the buck never stopped.
Oh, I've never heard that. Oh, I like that.
How do you go into an organisation like that, that's so unique, that has a license fee, has all these different strands to it, and go about creating culture change, and how are you sort of taken along on that journey?
Yeah. So I think, one of the things she talked to us about at length were the values of OD practitioners. So she drew on work of people like Warren Bennis and others, and that's always really stuck with me. So at the heart of really good OD is that dedication to democracy, that dedication to meaningful engagement, to get employee voice, that that sense of integrity and not colluding with a system, particularly if that system is doing harm in some way. And so that was always really at the forefront of my mind, and that really came into its own. And she lived and breathed that. So she wasn't just espousing this stuff, she was kind of living and breathing that. And I think there were two things that really struck me when I first met her, was first of all her comfort with silence. So being genuinely curious and asking people for their points of view, and then not feeling the need to jump in. So kind of really holding the silence. I think the other thing was the power of sharing stories. She willingly shared stories. So her own experiences, which really brought to life some of the issues and concepts that we were struggling with. And it's been 25 years on now almost. And that's the power of silence, the power of our stories as a way of connecting, and that kind of sense of humility as well has always really stuck with me, and something I've tried really hard to make sure I have at the heart of my own practice. Don't always get it right, but that's the human condition, isn't it? So yeah, and she would hold a room like no one I've ever seen, and I think it was because you felt she was genuinely interested in what you had to say, what you had to contribute. And the final thing is, I think she created space for Greg. I think as OD practitioners, it's not about us. Our role is to enable whoever the leader or leaders are to do what they need to do during whatever the change is. And so she worked alongside him, giving him wise counsel, challenging him as well, but giving him space to be who he needed to be to take the organisation to where it needed to get to. So there's a lot to unpack there, but yeah, that's...
No, it's interesting. And I guess sort of testimony to the culture change was the sort of when Greg Dyke left and how everybody came out to...
I
was quite something.
I have a placard. Yeah, I've never... Well, and we all signed. There's the very famous Times advert that had hundreds, if not thousands, of signatures from staff at all levels. from all departments, not just the program making departments. I've never seen anything like it in my life. And again, I think that the kind of academics in the field of OD and change in places like Harvard, I remember them commenting on the time going, have never seen anything like. Have you ever seen thousands of staff unite and come out at the same time around the world? So you had the radio TV stations around the world, staff coming out in time with those of us in the UK. Nobody had ever seen anything like that.
And what was it? I can't leave this question unasked, but what was it about his leadership that created that? Also, because this is in the time of like heroic leadership, so it wasn't necessarily of that mold of the time, though, was it? It was something different.
Well, I wouldn't necessarily call him a heroic leader, but I would call him a maverick leader. And I talk about this with students. So he didn't get the balance right, I think, which was his downfall. So his focus was 100% on staff. That meant he wasn't paying as much attention, I feel, on the Game of Thrones politics. So the kind of the board, the trust. And so there were all these machinations potentially going on behind the scenes with the then Labour government. And because he was so busy over here doing his travels, he committed to going to every part of the BBC, meeting with staff. I mean, he must have met with thousands, 30,000 staff. He must have met with thousands. He spent 6 months just going round. He even came to our little team. Nobody ever came to our little team. In fact, people tended to avoid us. I remember he sat down with us and he's like, what's it? And he was asking one question of everybody, what's it like to work here? And he listened. And that was part of the data gathering as well as the workshops that people like Mianne were running. And so staff fell in love with him. Nobody had ever asked us, what's it like to work here? What can make it better? And so all his time was over here. And actually, to be a good leader, you've got to be able to balance both. Otherwise, it'll be that Julius Caesar moment.
Yeah, but what a beautiful simplicity to a question to ask that doesn't cost anything to ask, and yet engenders such loyalty. And that's something that can't supply many organisations, isn't it?
Well, particularly if you're seen to be doing something about it.
I was going to say that's the key, isn't it? Is that actually listening to what's said in response and doing something about it.
Doing something. Yeah. That's what inspires the loyalty.
Wow. So that's part one of your career. This is a great question. So you've been catapulted into OD by someone who is esteemed in the industry or in the practice as being one of sort of the leaders in the whole field. Where did you go from there then? What happened next?
I carried on. So I did a mix of things. So got involved in work streams that had come out of the back of that initial culture work. So there was a massive work stream about leadership development because leadership needed to improve. So I ended up working as part of that. So doing everything from 360 feedback for leaders going on the leadership program with Ashridge through to training as an executive coach for that program. But alongside that, I continued my day-to-day work as an organizational psychologist, so doing kind of assessment centers, delivering training and development, doing mini culture reviews at a kind of a more local level. But it's a very flat structure, and I had ambitions, and it was such a flat structure. Unless the head of psychology was going to die, there was just nowhere to go. And so I ended up going on secondment to a different part of the BBC, so to rights and business affairs, and loved that. So they're the people that do all the licensing, the copyright, they engage with the artists and all that. So I love that. It was a year, and I ended up working on their culture change program. They had a bit, so Greg had gone at that point and Mark Thompson had come in, and there was a big financial crisis, and everybody was tasked with finding their pound of flesh, and rights and business affairs had a big amount to find, which was going to affect quite a lot of staff. And so I worked really closely with the leadership to develop the change strategy, and in particular the change communication and engagement approach. But that was a secondment. I was covering maternity leave and I didn't want to go back. And then an opportunity came up. So I had moved back to Croydon. And at that point, I always call it the two towers, like in Lord of the Rings. You had a Nestle building and the old Taberner house. And it was like the two towers. And they were the two biggest employers. And I always thought, God, if a job comes up at one of those places, and sure enough, Croydon Council brought in a new HR director, Pam, who basically root and branch decimated the old personnel, which had been departmental based, and she centralised. And within that, she created, so she had the traditional HR and HR business partners and all that, but she created a new function called OD. I got the job. And so I had to set up an OD function from scratch. And loved it. Yeah, had to slowly build my team, had to educate the organisation on what OD is and what it isn't. But what they thought it was not what it was. And then developed a 3-year OD strategy and with my team executed that, and I loved it. And then achieved some massive things with my team. So we won awards for the leadership program we designed and implemented, because it was the first leadership program of its kind that took a total place. So we opened it up to not just local authority staff, others. We needed to think about leadership of place. So it was open to like head teachers and stuff like that, and politicians. We wanted politicians to be on it as well, which wasn't always easy. And then I started to get headhunted internally. So the director of transformation, who I was coaching, said, I've got a secondment coming up and I don't want an IT person, a traditional IT person in that post. I want someone like you with that OD mindset to do some strategy work. And I was a bit like, okay, I'll give it a go. I went on secondment, and that taught me a lot, because I learned about commercial negotiation. I was managing the relationship with the outsourced IT provider. I mean, that was like a 300 million contract. And it was a very difficult contract, but I had to turn that relationship around. I developed the 5-year transformation strategy, but used an OD approach that was very much about that participation and democracy. And so people felt like the transformation strategy was theirs, the technology strategy was theirs. And so they had skin in the game on that. And we won some awards for our work on that. And then I got headhunted again, because that was a secondment. You can see a theme here, can't you? And the director of customer services said, I really like what you've done over there in transfer. Can you come and do that here? And that was tough at first. So I took on a team. I became head of customer strategy. And so I was responsible for developing the 5-year customer service strategy. I was responsible for complaints, which we were in a really bad place. We were in the press for our response to our really poor response time and our attitude to complaints. I was responsible for customer service training across the whole organisation. But I created that team, I built that team, I restructured it and then rebuilt it, and loved it, to the point where we turned around stuff so much and we became one of the best in the country for our complaints, that the then chief exec gifted me freedom of information. He was like, please have freedom of information, because we were like on the front page of the Daily Mail and stuff like that, because we were one of the worst in the country and you get big fines. So I took on freedom of information and data protection and worked with my team to put in place a new process and a system and turn that around as well. And then we're coming to the end, listeners. My role got merged with the head of communications role. So the head of comms had left, he'd moved on to a different job, and the chief exec and my boss were thinking, actually, sometimes Hayleys area has bumped into comms, so it just makes sense to merge it. And so I had to go for that because my role was redundant. And that was brutal. That was when things came to a head, because I'd then started to move so far from my original love and home of occupational psychology and org development. I felt completely out of my depth. And so that was a real trial by fire. I had half of my service who I'd inherited. So I had my original service, and then I had this other service like from PR and media, who wrote a letter to my boss saying she shouldn't get the job. She doesn't have a background as a journalist or PR. Nice. So that was what I was going into. Alongside, I was being written about. So the media started targeting me. Who is this woman? She's a psychologist. She's going to psychoanalyze the residents and manipulate you. And that was brutal. I remember it was Christmas holidays, and I got a text from one of the media team saying, I'm really sorry to send this to you. I think it was Boxing Day. I even remember what I was watching. It was Great Expectations with Gillian Anderson. That's how much it's imprinted in my brain.
My gosh.
And I got this alert on my work phone. And it was one of the media team saying, I'm really sorry, and sent me a link. And it was this absolute trash piece on me. It was awful. And I'd never experienced, just little old me. I do psychology and OD. And my husband looked at me, he said, are you okay? Because I'd gone so pale and I ran upstairs and vomited in the toilet because it was just the shock of it.
Yeah.
And I thought, what have I done? And so, so the first year of that role was hard, completely unforgiving. And I was right in the middle of the politicians as well, who are brutal. Or it can be brutal. And then I came out of that first year and started to come out the other side. And we had a number of crises that we had to deal with. And I'm pretty good in a crisis. And so that's when I turned the ship around, both in terms of my reputation, but also my teams. And the irony is, that was the role I had the longest in local government. I was in that role 4 years. And so then I left to set up on my own. And I had to do a Madonna again. I had to reinvent because people had forgotten that I'd started out all those years ago as a psychologist specialising in OD. They thought I was a comms expert. And so when I set up Halo, I was getting lots of people reaching out going, could you help us with our comms strategy? Could you do this? And I was like, no, I don't want, no. And so my first 6 to 12 months of Halo was me having to revamp who I was, completely reinvent what people knew me as, and also remind people. So I still do a lot of work for comms teams in local government now, but they know that I'm coming in there as a psychologist. I'm doing work with them on resilience and stuff like that. So I'm conscious I've talked for about 300
No,
years.
no,
Still listening. Well done.
We're building up a list of questions here, actually, because it's fascinating.
You'll be tested later.
Yeah,
You didn't know that when you were listening, did you?
One of the questions I was wondering there is, like, do you have a playbook for getting started? Because that seems to be a recurring theme, doesn't it? Which is, taking on an OD, nothing exists. How do you create it? How do you get consent from everyone you work with? Taking on the customer services role and bottoming it out and, getting to the point where you can move things forward. The strategy piece were something you hadn't done before in a field that was new to you, that has a traditional way of working. What do you have a sort of a playbook, or is it like sort of principles that you apply to begin something difficult?
Great question. So I think in terms of my playbook, it's being okay with not being the expert at all things. And that goes back to that humility I talked about that I kind of saw in Mian. And actually the higher you go, you can't, but and the bigger your team becomes. I mean, when I was head of comms, I had 50 people across 5 teams. I was responsible for a multi-million-pound budget. I can't be an expert in every little thing. I'm not a web designer. I don't know how to do coding. I'm not a kind of a journalist. And so, but what I can do is I can set direction. What I can do is look after my team. What I can do is protect them from the shit that comes in from all angles. But it starts with kind of making it clear, I think, to people, this is what I'm good at and this is what I bring to the table. But I also recognize I've got some gaps, and that's where I see you come in. So I think recognizing and owning what strengths you have, but also what your gaps are. One of the things that I found really helpful, particularly the IT role, because I remember my first month in that role, it's like people talking binary code. It's like beep bob 010. I felt like I was going into meetings just going. And so one of the things that I did in that role, and then that stood me in really good stead, and it's something that many of my coaching clients who've gone into roles they haven't got a clue about have found helpful, is so Richard Feynman, the Nobel Prize winning physicist, he famously kept a book called Things I Don't Know. And whenever he heard about something he didn't know, he'd write it down, make a note of it, and then he endeavoured to find out about it, speak to people about it. And then once he felt he knew about it, he could cross it off. I love that. And so I have my own version in an Excel spreadsheet because I love an Excel spreadsheet. And so in this IT role, every time I heard a phrase and I didn't yet feel comfortable enough to lean in and go, could you tell me what that is? I'd make a note of it. And then I'd go and find somebody who could explain it to me. And so kind of that stood me in really good stead ever since. And as I say, some of my clients, have benefited from that. And then I think the final thing in terms of the playbook is having a bit of a plan. So you'll both be familiar with the concept of the first 90 days. We know that your first few months is when you often make the biggest impact, and it's often when things are a little bit more forgiving. And so what is it you want to achieve? What is it you really want to achieve in your first week, your first month? And so I've always kind of had a plan either in my mind or tends to be written down, relationships I want to build in week one, processes I want to understand, things I need to read. So kind of setting myself little tasks. And then this is what the outcome I want to achieve. So I want to have done this by this point. That's roughly my playbook.
Great. And then just one element there as well, because there's kind of not knowing and humility, but it's not self-effacing. There's definitely massive amounts of self-efficacy, believing that you can make a difference. It's quite an interplay there, isn't it? In terms of, because it can easily be like, oh my God, I'm overwhelmed and I'm getting the press credit, but there's definitely an inner confidence there, believing, look, just give me time. I can make a big difference here.
Yeah, and that's such a powerful point, because I think in most of the roles that I've gone into, I've kind of tapped into self-efficacy, that kind of, okay, you've done this before, Hayley, you can do it again. You've been in unfamiliar situations. But I lost sight of that in that head of comms role. For that first year, I just lost my voice, and became a shadow of myself. I mean, I talk about whenever I do work on resilience and burnout and well-being, I always share my own story again, the power of sharing our stories. And I talk about basically having a breakdown in my first year. I was vomiting each morning before work. I was existing on 3 to 4 hour sleeps. I was getting up at 5 to get into work for 6. I was working till kind of midnight just to keep on top of everything. And it was quite a macho environment I was in. And people said, oh, it's okay to ask for help or admit you don't know. That's bullshit. No. And so I became more and more insular and lost my voice and forgot that I'd done hard things before and I could do them again. And it was only through the intervention of 2 really good work friends who I remain indebted to for the rest of my life, who intervened with my boss, because my boss was on at me, and it just became this vicious circle where I was underperforming, going quieter and quieter, retreating into myself. He was on at me because I wasn't delivering, because he was getting it in the neck from politicians. And 2 of my colleagues on the leadership team we were part of apparently took him to one side and said, have you not noticed that Hayley's not speaking in meetings and she's just, she looks ill, she's pale. Have you not noticed that? And that was like it was like a wake-up call for him. And to be fair to him, he wasn't an easy person to work with, but he was incredibly fair and he would own his mistakes. And he instantly leaned in and said, what help do you need? What do you need from me? So we started to work differently. I got a coach. Basically, I had support wrapped around me. And slowly but surely, the Hayley of old started to come back, but almost like a Hayley 2.0. And I often get asked, whenever I'm kind of talking at events or when I'm talking to students, if you could go back, would you say no to that role? Would you do things differently? Would you stay at the BBC? No, because the person sat here in front of you with all these stories, with this alleged expertise, and it's because of all of that. And the reason I feel really privileged and lucky to have so many coaching clients is because lots of them say that they feel I get it. I'm not spouting a load of theory at them. Not that a coach does that, but you know what I mean? I've sat in their shoes. I know how it feels when you're under the cosh from everybody. You can't do right for doing wrong. You're struggling at work. You're struggling at home. I've lived and breathed it, and I think it's made me a better, more compassionate, more effective practitioner and coach.
And just to sort of take that learning, if you're driving change, it can be a really lonely place. You become the lightning rod for so many things, and there's so much things, emotion projected onto you. I think Steve Hearson describes it as the node through which the crazy flows.
I love that.
And we often sort of find leaders in this place, and not everyone has two work colleagues that can help them come back. What's advice would you help people to start taking those steps back to being themselves again, to help them get through it, or to feel resourced?
Yeah, so I think it's hard to do it on your own. And if you don't have colleagues who know you well enough to see the monumental change and that you need help, then think about who can fill that gap. But, what's your network like? Are you part of a professional network, for example, of change experts? And have you got a good relationship with some of those? Could you talk to them? I spoke on another podcast recently, and we were talking about guilt and shame are often the things that hold us back and mean we don't admit maybe when we're struggling. But there's nothing to be guilty or ashamed of. We all struggle at various points. And the way we can kind of disrupt that is by just saying it to someone that we trust, whether it's a colleague in our organisation, or if I'm a consultant going in, whether it's a kind of a peer that I've got a good relationship with, or even a friend. But actually saying it out loud, do you know what, I'm really struggling with this, almost takes the power out of that, because otherwise it just becomes this demon that eats away at you. So externalizing that stuff in some way is really important, whilst keeping yourself safe. There's certain sectors, again, very macho. It's all about, how things look. So again, I'm realistic enough to know you've got to be savvy about who you open up to. But hopefully there will be at least one person you could.
Yeah, and I was also thinking the power of telling your story, as you said, is really important, isn't it? Because when we look at successful people or people who've succeeded, it's really easy to present a very linear version of their success and how they got there, and they miss out all the kind of the dips and the challenges and the hard bits. And then people think, well, somebody's gone from A to B and they've made it look easy. Then if my path's not like that, then I'm doing something wrong, or I've got this wrong.
It's one of the reasons why those new into the field of occupational psychology, those doing their MSc, for example, I openly share I failed my dissertation for my MSc, and I realise my age, the experience, where I am now in my career enables me to share that story. But also I see it as my duty as an alleged, I don't say this about myself, but somebody called me the other day a wise elder, less of the elder, but I see that as those of us who are further ahead in our lives and our careers. I see it as our duty to share some of that stuff, to take the stigma out of it. And because it's all very nice, and look, I'd be lying if I said it's not a nice ego stroke when people are telling you how blooming wonderful you are, and God, it's amazing where you've got to. And so the reason I also share the story is to give myself a reality check. But when I get students who are just like, I can never get there, and they're comparing where they are now with where you are now, and as you rightly say, Danny, they're not seeing the 20, 25 years of ups and downs and pains and sacrifice. And so, yes, that's one of the reasons why I share stories like that.
Brilliant.
There's no shame in it. The shame is if you don't learn from it.
I had another question about change. So when you were talking about your career history, you talked about developing strategies and the kind of the importance of participation and democracy and really helping people feel a sense of ownership of strategies. Why are we still getting that wrong? Why are so many organizations still not cracking that?
So I'm probably going to make lots of enemies now. The word that pops it, laziness.
Okay.
I also think sometimes not enough time is allowed. So the laziness bit is, it's easier, isn't it? It's easier just just work from home or go in a room somewhere and do a bit of desktop analysis and just write the strategy. And then we wonder why that strategy lies in a darkened room somewhere, and it gets signed off, but nothing ever happens. And it is hard work. If I think about the technology and transformation strategy, that took a lot of planning, and I ran with my team 15 workshops. So there were at that point there were 8 departments in the local authority. I'm just doing that because I'm seeing the structure in my head. There were 8 departments, and so we ran 2 workshops for 7 of them and 1 for one of the smaller ones, and we were cross-cutting. So we were having a mix of staff in each of those workshops. So from the most senior through to the most junior, and took an OD approach. So did some really interesting activities to get people thinking about the now compared to the future and doing a gap analysis. Oh, it's great. It was just like we had pictures everywhere and brown paper. It was great. And so, but that was a lot of work. And then there was a lot of data to analyze. But it's why when the rubber hit the road, it hit the road really quickly. So the chief exec said he'd never, so the strategy went to the leadership team first, and then it had to be ratified by the politicians at cabinet. He said he'd never seen a strategy get through that process so quickly. There was usually like a lot, but sometimes 16 iterations. Not with this one. Got signed off straight away by the leadership team, went straight through to cabinet, got signed off straight away. And so we were able to hit the road, and people were already bought in. We weren't having to do a massive education piece because they knew what was in the strategy because it was their strategy. But that takes effort. I mean, from end to end, that took 6 months. And so then the time thing comes in. If we haven't factored in enough time, if we haven't honoured and respected that good strategy development, meaningful strategy development, to have a strategy that's going to make a difference takes time. If we've left it to the last minute, then we are going to hurry it and just leave it to some poor person to do on their own.
Sometimes leaving it to the last minute is a tactic in itself, though, isn't it? Like not leaving ourselves the time to do it properly. And that's
we don't have time, and we've got a legal responsibility to get this straight. Yeah, just nonsense. I've become much more unforgiving as I've got older.
It's the time and energy you then have to invest afterwards when you've got you have to find the time and the energy somewhere.
I feel it's always better to front load that
Absolutely.
effort. Because when you start to roll out work streams or initiatives, it's almost like the bulk of the work's already been done. When you go to children's services or whatever departments are relevant in your organisation, they're like, oh, I know what you're talking about. Yeah. Whereas if you haven't done that, you're met with crossed arms and you're having to kind of start from the very beginning about why you've suggested this thing. And before you know it, again, you've lost another 6 months.
Yeah. You talk about, you did a keynote recently about navigating change in a positive way. And what's really nice is you kind of pulled out, because sometimes with the field need to bring out the most modern, fresh theory. And you talked about William Bridges, for example, about sort of allowing people to let go. And then that kind of that neutral zone that we live in organizations where we're kind of, the change hasn't started yet, but we're all discombobulated and kind of waiting for it. And then the new beginning, like, is it possible in our organizations where there's just this feeling of continuous change and too many priorities and conflicting needs to navigate change in a positive way?
I think it is possible. I mean, the thing at the heart of my talk last week, and I wrote a blog post about it, which goes out in my newsletter in a minute, is think about what you can control. And also, it's not just necessarily workplace changes that you're navigating. You might have changes going on at home. You might suddenly have an elderly parent who's been diagnosed with dementia, and that's a massive change to deal with, let alone your job's being restructured. And so we're more than the changes than we're facing at work. And so facing all of that, it's about thinking what is in your control. And so there's a couple of well-known frameworks. So I talked about a circle of control. More fundamentally than that, I talked about the ABC technique as a way of reframing how we explain things to ourselves. But the essence within all of that is focusing on what is in your gift, because our energy is limited, our time is limited in this ever, hyper-connected, always on world, constant change. And so where we put our energy matters, but we need to pay attention to that. Am I getting angry about and putting all my energy into conversations that may or may not have happened by leadership and talking in darkened corners about what they did wrong and la la la? That's not in my control. I mean, it's a bit cathartic, not in my control. What is in my control is, okay, my job's been affected. Do I have the skills that are needed? What support might I need? Do I need to go on a course? Do I need to reach out to my network? Because actually I might need to think about getting a job elsewhere because I don't want to work in this organisation anymore. So kind of bringing it back to you. And I talk a lot about siphoning out a lot of the noise that can go on. And look, I've been as guilty of it as the rest. There's something quite nice about being around the water cooler and slagging people off, and oh, isn't it terrible? And but if that goes on for too long, that just can become unhealthy. We can start to feel out of control. We can start to feel done to. And so stepping away from that noise, stepping away from that anger, stepping away from that rumor and kind of innuendo, and just thinking about yourself and thinking, what do I need and what do I need to do, can be one of the most powerful things we do.
What's the biggest lessons you've learned to date?
What, just in life? That's a big old question. What, in life?
I was going to let you decide the boundaries of the question there, but I guess looking at your LinkedIn profile, you're having a milestone at the moment, and that's often sort of drives reflection as well, doesn't it? And I guess you are kind of bringing the next generation of occupational psychologists through. You're really trying to encourage the next generation of organization development consultants to come through. What are some of the biggest lessons that you've learned so far that you would want them to sort of take on board?
I think it's quite a trite thing, and lots of people say it. You're more than your job, you're more than your work. Make sure you have a well-rounded life. I think it was only really when I hit my 40s that I understood that. So work, it had all been about work up until that point in my career. And so my whole identity was around that. And so the danger of that is, if you only have one thing that you're reliant on for your sense of self-worth and identity, if something impacts that, right, bad things can happen. And so having a well-rounded life is important. And it was the sudden death of my dad at the start of my 40s that really reinforced that. Dad died unexpectedly, and then my mum was diagnosed with terminal cancer the month after Dad's funeral. And I said to my husband, the universe is trying to tell me something here. Because I grew up in a kind of a working class family. When I was a kid, money was tight. And then as time went on, capitalist culture and that, and mum and dad started to earn a bit more money, but it was always about squirreling money away. And we'll celebrate our retirement, we'll enjoy our retirement next year. And that never happened. And so that was a big lesson for me, is don't leave it. And so when I started to work for myself, and it's something I still do now, I don't work every day. I don't work Fridays, I don't work weekends. I'm very bound. I've always been very boundary, but I'm even more boundaried, because having a well-rounded life, having time with family and friends, having time on hobbies, learning new things is as important, and I think makes me more interesting. How boring must I have been just talking about my job all the time?
But it's good advice, isn't it? Because I think it's unfortunate it takes an event like that to create greater sense of perspective and more balance. But a lot of the roles that people find themselves in are utterly absorbing, aren't they? And the job will never tell you that's enough. And it'll take as much as you've got, won't it?
Yeah. And the other lesson is, don't confuse other people's career aspirations for yours. So when I started my long old journey in local government, so when I had that first headhunt, when I went into that technology role and I did this strategy work, and I was being lauded and everything, and people suddenly started to pay attention, because before I'd been it's that sweet little OD team. They do the fun stuff, even though we did some really meaty stuff. And suddenly people were like, ooh. And a few really senior people at the highest level were saying, we think you could be a chief executive. Because I had quite low self-esteem, it's something I still struggle with now. It didn't take much, a couple of nice ego strokes, and I was like, really? And suddenly my obsession was becoming a chief exec of a local authority. Never had I dreamt of that. I didn't light my fire, but I told myself it did. And so those other offers that I got to move into customer services to do, that was part of me confusing other people's aspirations for me and telling me they were mine when they weren't. And it was only when I came out the other side, set up Halo, came back to my beloved roots of occupational psychology, that I feel I've shone, no pun intended, with my branding, because I'm doing what I feel I was meant to do. I was never meant to be a local gov chief exec. I'm in awe of those who do it, but so yeah, so don't confuse other people's aspirations for yours.
Brilliant. Sound advice. So just a couple more questions. So one is, obviously you've spent a lot of time learning and developing yourself. What does that look like for you now? How do you invest in your own learning and development now?
Well, funny you say that, Danny, because I was thinking about exactly that today. So obviously I have to track my continuing professional development just in case I'm ever audited by the BPS or the HCPC. So there's a bit of an alphabet soup there. So as a coach, I have a coaching supervisor. So I meet with my coaching supervisor every 2 months. She is absolutely worth her weight in gold. We have incredible conversations that really help me to reflect deeply and I think make me a better coach. The other things I do include it's conference season coming up. So the Division of Occupational Psychology hasn't had an in-person conference for a long time, like many since the pandemic. So it's our first in-person 3 days. Woo! So I'm going to that. The Division of Coaching Psychology conference as well. I'm going to that. I sign up for webinars. I do a lot of reading, as you both know. So I read a lot of research articles, which I have to as an evidence-based practitioner, and I like to role model that to our students. I read a lot of books as well. And so I'll always be making notations in books or journals, and then I kind of capture that. I've got big databases of stuff. So it means I've always got access when I'm designing talks or training or stuff like that. So yeah, that's broadly what I do.
Yeah. And then are they the inspiration for the lovely sketch notes that everybody will have seen all over LinkedIn? Yeah.
They are, yes. So sketch notes are a combination of things that I have used throughout my career and that I'm passionate about and that I think managers could benefit from knowing, as well as new things that I discover. So because it helps anchor my learning if it's a new thing, or if I'm summarizing a study, for example, it helps anchor my understanding. So it's a win-win all round.
Fabulous. Yeah, and the world's very happy you do those.
Oh,
I know
and
lots
I'm
of
very
people who love
happy.
them. Yeah.
Who doesn't like a bit of colouring in? It's so therapeutic.
And we have a lot of people who actually watch this that are just getting started in organization development, or they're looking in and wanting to get started. What advice would you give people just at the very beginning of their OD career?
So get a mentor, find a mentor if you don't have one already. There was a really interesting study. I'll share it if you want to share it in this. I think it's open access. But I'll share the reference anyway. Let me just make a note of it. If I don't write it, I'm 50. If I don't write it down, I'll forget it. But there was a really interesting study, I think it was from about 2019, 2018, that looked at the impact of mentoring on those starting out in their OD career. And it found that mentoring had the biggest impact. So find a mentor. If there's somebody in your organization who's more experienced around OD, reach out to them. If maybe you're a little bit alone in your organization, you can reach out to Danny and Garen because they'll be maybe able to introduce you to all the wonderful people they know. So yeah, finding a mentor. I think go on some kind of training and development. So think about all the things you'd like to learn and the best ways for you to learn that. So there might be some techniques such as T groups, for example, or appreciative inquiry, where you might want to go on a course. There might be other things where it's okay just to read or watch videos. But again, a bit like what I was talking about earlier, have your own little what I don't know book and just kind of keep a note of that. And that's also a really good way of tracking your progress. Become part of a professional network. So there's all sorts of great OD networks out there, and I'd encourage you to join one of those if you're not joined up to those already. And again, a great way to learn, a great way to build relationships. And we know a really important thing at the heart of good OD is relationships. It's about people.
Wonderful. Well, Hayley, just want to say a huge thank you. You've brought a real refreshing honesty and generosity of spirit to the conversation. When we set out to sort of do the podcast, what we really wanted to do is to invite practitioners like you to come in and just share what does it mean to have a career and to share what it really is like as well. And you've really been able to articulate that in a really engaging way. And I got loads of things I'm going to take away. I'm sure you do as well, Danny. I guess I really like the thing about the importance of, for leaders, like the importance of keeping the nerve, keeping calm, keeping perspective, keeping an eye on the horizon when things get difficult, and the importance of the values of OD and sort of how they can be sort of role models, sort of the dedication to democracy, being comfortable with silence and letting the silence do the heavy lifting when you're actually working with people, power of connection, the power of humility, and the role that plays in change, and the fact that a lot of the work in change is not about us, and it's about giving the leader space as well, which I really liked. And then, but you've got to get the balance right. You've got to make sure that all your different stakeholders are engaged in the journey that you're taking them on, and that when you do find yourself in a role where you feel a little bit out of your depth and it's brand new, that it's okay not being the expert, but being really clear on where you add the value. And just that there's a role that guilt and shame plays, and making sure that it doesn't color too much how your natural way of working, and also focusing on what's in your gift as well. And a really nice nugget as well, which is like, don't confuse other people's career aspirations with your own as well, to be really clear on where you're going in your career as well. So those are just some of my takeaways. That's a pretty impressive list, isn't it? Anything from you?
I was going to say, what's left for me? But
not much.
Bingo.
But no, you've covered so much. I think for me, the only things I add was that the power of stories and the really importance of sharing those with people, and how it helps us connect and people really understand what's going on. And I'm starting my own things I don't know list. So that's my takeaway. I'm going to buy myself a new notebook. It's a good
excuse for a notebook. I know. My husband says I should set up my own stationery shop. He's like, why have you got all these pens and empty notebooks? Because I do, all right.
I know. I have the same conversations here. Yeah. So, yeah.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for your time. I know you're extraordinarily busy with all the different things that you're interested in. If people want to reach out to you, if they want to follow your sketch notes, if they want to sort of see some of the professional things that you're sharing, you have a newsletter. What's the best way for people to reach out to?
So either via LinkedIn, always come and say hello, connect with me. I'm very friendly. Or via my website, so haylowpsychology.com. You can connect with me via there. It's got my details, and there's also all sorts of free resources for you to pillage away.
Brilliant. And can you promise when you do your memoirs, can you come back on the podcast? Is that okay?
I'd love that. I'd love that, yeah.
We'll be right there for you. Okay.
I'll be like Winston Churchill with his diaries. It'll be like volume 13.
With a little bit of Jilly Cooper in there as well.
Yeah. Oh, hang on a minute. Yeah, no, I'd love to come back. It's not unknown for me to be on a podcast more than once, but yeah.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Thank you so much for asking me, and I hope your listeners enjoyed the talk.
Brilliant. Thanks so much.
You're very welcome.
Thank Hayley.